Ayrton Senna, Portrait of a Racing Legend, is published to mark the 25th anniversary of Ayrton's death, an illustrated retrospective biography of a man who illuminated Formula One in a 10-season career that was almost without parallel. It's by Bruce Jones, former author of, an editor, of Autosport magazine, and one of the most respected commentators and reporters around the world. Delighted to be joining me live on the line, Bruce Jones himself. Bruce, good afternoon to you.
Hi, Charles. What a lovely intro there.
Oh, well,
picking me up like that.
We try. It's isn't it? It's hard to believe it's been 25 years.
Well, that was almost my entry point. I remember when I was first aware of Ayrton, 1981. I was at university and I was desperate for him because I didn't have a car that first year to come to my local circuit, or the circuit closest to university, which was Snetterton. I thought, what's all this hype about? 2 minutes after I'd seen him drive, it was no hype. He was just solidly the real thing. And of course, fast forward through the most meteoric of careers. But actually, I must say, just now, flicking through the book, the images still seem so fresh. How can it be 25 years ago?
What was he driving? Was it a British F3 at Snetterton that year?
No, he'd been driving in Formula Ford. That was his first season. He did 1981 in Formula Ford 1600, 1982 in Formula Ford 2000 at Britain and around Europe. Just winning wherever he went. And then 1983 was his epic sort of seesawing season in British Formula 3, where started incredibly strongly. Then Martin Brundle suddenly got the upper hand, and it really was a tussle the whole way to the finish. And read the book and you'll find out why it went away from Ayrton, and then a little bird told him something and everything was sorted out thereafter, but he really had to scrap. And that was in a season that he was just galloping away. So it really didn't do his psyche a lot of good at all.
And then came 84 and that drive at Monaco in the Tolman, and the whole world sat up and took notice of this Brazilian talent. Yeah,
I mean, they'd have had to be quite asleep or not paying any attention to what some sort of Formula One snobs call the nursery slopes, not to be aware that this guy was a star. Tolman had some real talent in the making in terms of the guys in the team like Rory Byrne doing design and so many others involved there, but these were their early steps in Formula One. They had almost no money. They worked wonders. But that drive at Monaco was scintillating. And a lot of people, though, forget that they will remember the fact that the checkered flag was brought out early because it was incredibly wet. They will remember that Ayrton was just ripping into the lead of Alain Prost and actually passed him by the checkered flag. But when they throw the red, you have to count back a lap. But what they all forget is another unbelievable talent, Stefan Beloff in the Tyrrell, was catching the two of them. It was streaming wet. It was horrible. One slip and you're in the barriers there. So it was a case of a day that really launched two racing careers. And for Alain Prost, it was just the biggest sigh of relief ever. He knew he had a number on his back, a target on his back, and the hunter had caught him.
And then comes 85 and the move to Lotus. And, I'm on the social media and I think it's something like 30 years or whatever it is, or whatever, since his first win in the wet in Portugal.
It was just... that was a drive that he really did walk on water that day. It was unbelievably wet. Cars were going off everywhere, and Ayrton was just tearing ever further and further into the lead of the race. And afterwards they said, how come you didn't make a single mistake? He said, I did. And at a couple of points he actually aquaplaned off the circuit, but just had a bit of fortune, or maybe the car was just pointing in pretty much the right direction to let him get back. But this was Lotus. This wasn't one of the top teams at the time. It was starting what was going to become a little bit of a decline. But also another thing about Lotus was the fact that in his teams, from his first year in Formula Ford upwards, they got larger each year. But moving from Tolman to Lotus, he was moving from a sort of Tyro team to one that was very much the establishment. So he had to be able to motivate more than just a handful of people. But as soon as they saw him, as soon as he got his backside into one of their cars, the mechanics didn't mind working all night because they knew if they gave him the car, he would deliver. And I think that's a very powerful thing when you're trying to get a team around you. And, doing that win so early in his Lotus career just really helped everyone around him.
I mean, that's just one of the things about Ayrton. I mean, he was so totally professional, but also seemed very, very down to earth and but at the same time, almost otherworldly in his approach to racing.
He was. I mean, nothing was left, sort of no stone was left unturned. And one of the things when I was putting the book together was trying to find quotes that really summed him up. And here's one from Peter Waugh, who was the team principal then. He said, the mechanics always know more quickly than the team manager whether a driver has got it or hasn't. And they knew right away that Ayrton had got it because they just looked at him and he was all-consuming. And Peter went on to say, Also, if Ayrton made a mistake, he'd be the first to admit it. But obviously the flip of that, he said if you made a mistake, he'd be the first to tell you. So he expected that excellence. He was going to deliver excellence from his side, so he was determined that everyone else would.
Then comes the legendary years. He joins McLaren, a top team, and the rest, as they say, is history. But this was perhaps one of the most successful F1 partnerships between a driver and a team, perhaps since Clark and Lotus.
Yeah, I mean, to come into a team that was really on the bubble, but more than that, it wasn't just a team. It was a team with Alain Prost. You had the two fastest drivers in Formula One together without any team orders. And, I mean, at first they seemed to get on quite well, and then clearly racing drivers are racing drivers. They want to beat above all people their teammate. And they just won and won and won, with the exception of one Grand Prix that year where there was a clash out on the circuit. But what you had there was, the team bosses, Ron Dennis, must have felt as though he'd lit two fireworks and wanted to hold on to both of them, but he knew it might hurt. And it was just remarkable, and one of the most beautiful Formula One cars ever. The cars did look magnificent back then. They were much cleaner in their design than they are, because as soon as aerodynamicists since then have been using wind tunnels and computer modelling, they've added little wings here, there and everywhere. But back then, very simple livery, but also two drivers with totally different driving styles. So that provided a sort of yin and yang for the fans to get to enjoy. But also it was a soap opera, because you sort of felt this was something that could unravel, because you had the two main guys going at each other the whole time. I
mean, Prost was nicknamed the Professor because of his style of driving, and Ayrton was just 120% all the time.
I mean, there were times, it's very easy to think back and get, Prost delivered because he was so consistent and stuff. Prost was also an unbelievably fast driver. He just never looked it because of his style, where Ayrton on a qualifying lap was, as he went through his McLaren years, more and more outstanding. Most famously at Monaco, where, he was dealing with millimetre accuracy, right on the edge of where one little slip up, bang in the barrier, end of all of that. They were very different about how they went about things, but I just want to reiterate that Prost was, against anybody else, is really quick, but also against Ayrton he was really quick, and it made Ayrton raise his game.
What was it about Monaco and Ayrton? Because if you're looking at defining performances through his career, apart from that lap at Donington, you just immediately remember him doing these, again, otherworldly laps around that street circuit.
I think with Ayrton, so much of it was visualization. I mean, often you walk around a collection area or a paddock before the drivers go out to qualifying or up and down a pit lane, and you can see them a bit like a downhill skier, sort of swaying from side to side. They're imagining the lap. But Ayrton went way beyond that. And as he said once famously, he actually scared himself. He was driving on his subconscious more than his conscious at Monaco, and he suddenly spooked himself. But at that point, he was 1.5 seconds a lap faster than anyone else. And that's on a fairly short circuit. He had this ability to dig deep inside himself, and maybe just close everything else out. But Monaco, I think, because to be ultra-fast there, you have to have unbelievable precision and bravery, and he was prepared to do that to make sure he got pole. And, of course, pole is the biggest gift at any circuit, but never more than Monaco. If you do that, make a decent start, you're sitting fairly pretty at the front of the race.
And what was the reaction like? It's very easy with 25 years ago for him to be lauded as this sort of messianic, this Messiah type figure. But I remember following F1 in these years, and I wasn't a big Senna fan at the time because of the way that he was determined. He would put the fear of God into back markers. So if you saw him coming up behind you in that yellow helmet, you got out of the way. And I mean, I was a Mansell fan, and he upset Nigel on several occasions.
Yeah, he did. He wasn't prepared to take any prisoners, but you knew if you saw that yellow helmet with the blue and green stripes on the side coming up, he wasn't going to wait for a second chance. He was going to lap you there and then. It was your job to get out of the way. And also, in a reason a lot of people didn't warm to Ayrton is he just thought, I'm the best driver. There is no debate in that. And so he didn't cut anyone any slack. He almost expected them to get out of the way. And so I can see, I know full well that people were divided, I think more so than now, into camps according to which driver they supported. But you just looked at him, and I can think of many moments in his career where I stood there and you just thought, you are on another level to pretty much anybody else out there. it might be a small moment, just going back to his Tolman year. I remember standing at Paddock Hill Bend at Brands Hatch. He's in the Tolman with plenty of wing, all sorts of power, but, wasn't the world's greatest handling car. And his performance around there, you didn't need to put a stopwatch on it. It just was demonstrably quicker than pretty much anyone else, even those in the best cars.
When he had the incident with Prost at Suzuka, of course, and he had two of them, but the one in the same team, that made Formula One, if it wasn't sort of world famous and global talking point already, took it to another level again.
Well, it did. I think you look at, it doesn't really matter what sport it is. At certain points in certain sports, you get two protagonists who they're pure soap opera. They're so much better than the rest. Or look, don't forget, also in Formula One, you need a really good car. It doesn't have to be the best, but they were in the best car. It really was. It wasn't a case of fighting with anyone else. So it boiled down to the two of them fighting together. They'd stopped talking to each other at that point, and to be honest, it was the fault of one year, the fault of the other the next year. But Ayrton perceived, if he perceived people were against him, he wouldn't hold back, and he was really upset that pole position, which he qualified on, was put on the dirty side of the track. They wouldn't swap it over for him. And so he made a poor start. Prost got ahead, and wham bam, thank you.
And I mean, there was an awful lot of politics going on there, because Prost was French. The then head of FISA was, of course, Jean-Marie Balest, who was very, very pro-French. So, and stripped him of the points.
No, entirely, and those things come through loud and clear. And if anybody's not seen Senna the movie, do. But obviously, that was a point that was laboured at some length. But Jean-Marie Balest, even if he wasn't, I don't actually particularly think he was being biased. I just think he couldn't help himself in some ways. But Ayrton decided he was being biased. And, we got to the point that we nearly had Ayrton not starting the following season because he refused, they refused to sort of kiss and make up. But thank goodness they did.
1992, 1993, he's at his best with McLaren, would you say?
I think, actually, the funny things, when your car is the best in the field, it was either him or Prost. By this stage, the McLaren was no longer the best in the field because Williams was, with your hero Nigel Mansell, was just wiping everything before him in that magnificent Williams. And some of the drives that Ayrton produced just to stay near the front were phenomenal. And in fact, I think they were some of the ones that gave him the greatest satisfaction. He knew he didn't have the kit to fight for the World Championship. And he could have backed off, especially once he knew he was going to Williams for 1994. But early that season, that drive in the wet on the opening lap of the European Grand Prix at Donington Park was just extraordinary. Opening lap alone, rest of the race, absolutely astonishing. And I think he was at his peak. Then, of course, he thought, rubbing his hands together, look at the success that's happened at Williams. I'm finally going to drive for a team I tested for, but they didn't have a drive for me before I got to Formula One. And then, as we all know, 1994 wasn't exactly a dream from the outset.
I mean, he has problems with the car. He gets punted off in the first two races, and then we have that weekend.
The weekend that had more misfortune, mishap than you could possibly write into the worst horror story. I was standing with the Jordan press officer, Louise Goodman. We were watching when Rubens Barrichello went clattering over the barriers at Varian Tabassa, and we both looked at each other and thought, oh my golly. Fortunately, he was okay. That really spooked Ayrton, his compatriot Rubens Barrichello, and sort of, Rubens always saw Ayrton as a mentor. And then the very next day with Roland Ratzenberger, unheralded, huge friend of all of us. I'd known Roland from his Formula Ford days, was a good friend of mine, so that was an absolute body blow. But it was just that everything that went after that. JJ Leto, back near the front end of the grid, being told, having fractured his neck before the start of the season, one more blow from behind and you'll be in a wheelchair. And by the way, he was Roland's best friend. They drove from Bologna Airport to Imola for the race together, and so he stalls. I think he was 5th or 6th on the grid. Every car, until the very last one, jinked past him, and then Pedro Lami's Lotus hit him. Wheel went flying into the crowd with suspension. A few spectators injured. It could have been a whole lot worse. JJ completely spooked. As it was, the impact didn't damage his neck, but he knew he'd been really close. He also, like Ayrton, unfortunately at this point, probably didn't even want to be racing because the loss of Roland really, really hit Formula One very hard. Death was something from decades before, and suddenly it had come home to roost. But what then unfurled when the race restarted after they'd trundled around behind a safety car that wasn't fast enough? I think it was an Opel Ascona by memory. So there was a concern later, an impact, a safety change after that. You always had to have a safety car that could lead the field round at a decent pace, because otherwise their tyres will drop away from temperature. Then, of course, green flag is waved, field goes herring off, and Ayrton suddenly spears off the circuit. But it didn't look particularly bad. We've had far bigger accidents at that point on the Imola circuit at Tamburello. And so we thought, well, he's out of the race. Gosh, that's 3 races in a row. And then everything unfolds, and we suddenly realised that all was not right.
I mean, I remember seeing
just the darkest of days.
Yeah, I mean, I remember seeing Berger, who was a big friend of Ayrton's, go off on that same corner. Was it 89 in the Ferrari? And the Ferrari caught fire, and we thought, blimey, is he going to get out?
That was the big spectacle. I remember seeing him a few weeks later with hands all bandaged, walking around at Monaco, just waving to the crowds. But Ayrton's impact didn't look anything like that. It didn't have the flame. It seemed as a nice oblique angle with the barriers, but sort of in a freakish way, that front suspension just came through his visor hole.
I mean, you said
it was a bit like, sort of looking away from a darts board and throwing a dart over your head and hitting a bullseye. It was just, there's so many little factors, but just with the most gruesome and awful conclusion. And then, that wasn't the end of the disaster. It was the biggest disaster of the race meeting. We had Michele Alboreto lose a rear wheel. It bounced down the pit lane, bounced off the head of some mechanics. No one knew what to do. Frankly, there were so many things. We all expected our planes to sort of crash on takeoff that night. It was awful, but 25 years ago, that feels 25 years ago, but the vibrancy of Ayrton and his racing never dies. I mean, it feels like 10 years ago that I last saw him race. He was just that magnificent.
So when it comes to putting together a book and looking at his legacy, because he's still massive. I mean, it's, mention Senna, and everybody's got a favourite drive anywhere in the world. In Brazil, he was more than a national. I mean, he was Brazil when he was racing, and Brazil, was his on a Sunday afternoons. So how do you appraise his legacy and gather together the information for the book?
His legacy is not just in terms of what he did on the track, it was what he meant to young Brazilians. He put an awful lot of money, of the awful lot of money he earned, back into Brazil. He started a comic, that may sound trivial, but the proceeds from that comic went towards educating, Brazilians who have very little money. He really did a huge amount, and what he would have achieved had he lived on into retirement. He was determined to make a difference. Ayrton felt really, he said, all you European drivers are lucky. You can sort of live at home and do your racing. I've had to uproot my whole life to come and live in Europe, and it's very different, and I really miss Brazil. And in fact, through the winters towards the latter days of his Formula One, he tried to spend as much time away from Europe, tried to do as little testing as possible so he could maximize his sort of recharging of his batteries on his ranch down in Brazil. Brazil was massive for Ayrton, and he knew that his impact on, Brazilians wherever they were was huge. How to gather information for the book? Obviously, when someone's been dead for 25 years, interviews are impossible. But I happened to do a huge project for the Senna Foundation, and I had a lot of material from that, which slightly worried me once when I heard that Ayrton's mother was proofreading all of it or having a little look through and went, I didn't know that. And you start wondering if you've been entirely accurate. But, there are so many people will always want to talk to about Senna. There are plenty of stories out there. And I think everyone, whatever their age, at whichever point in their career, they knew Ayrton. He made such an impact on them that the stories sort of remain fresh in their minds.
And also, I mean, after that weekend in Imola, of course, F1 changed a lot as well. Did a lot of it wasn't seen as a completely safe sport. A lot of circuits were redesigned. F1 went back to Imola, but it's not on the calendar anymore.
No, there was hardly surprisingly, a bit of a knee-jerk reaction, and the very next race, Carl Wendlinger just had a freak accident and was put in a coma for 3 weeks, and Formula One starting to feel really haunted. Then after that, I can't remember if it was after that or the next, which way round, but the Spanish Grand Prix, they put some really rather ridiculous-looking chicanes in. Formula One was scared of its shadow at that point because they knew that if there was to be another really bad accident and, perish the thought, another death, then it might lead to considerable issues for the sport. And in fact, even at the Spanish Grand Prix with this ridiculous chicanes, literally stacks of tyres plonked onto the circuit, there was a big shunt for Andrea Montermini. And, luckily he's a very short chap because he took the front end off his car and everyone's thinking, no, this cannot keep happening. But many changes were made, not only to the structures of the car, they suddenly made the sides of the cockpit higher to reduce the likelihood of anything coming in from the side. And obviously, in the last couple of years, we've had the arrival of the halos around and in front of the drivers' heads to do a similar thing. And though people will go, oh, they make the cars look so ugly, people become accustomed to them. And of course, sports can't really go around now with people getting killed. In the 60s and 70s, it's just what happened. But for sort of culpability and also, you don't want people being killed is a simple answer. But yeah, manifold changes to cars, to circuits, to driving equipment, all within the view of keeping drivers safe. And we will never have another Ayrton Senna, but we will have other major stars. And I think this season's very exciting with young Leclerc just showing phenomenal form, and others just have to get their tails into the right seat. But we want Formula One to continue over the decades, and so whatever changes need to be made, as long as they don't neuter the cars or the circuits too much, are worthy of consideration.
So, looking back at the book and looking back at his career, is there one moment that you remember or you found in the book that sums up what Ayrton was about in his driving, in his approach to life as a man?
Some will say win at all costs. I would just say succeed at all costs was really Ayrton. And I think you have to look at his phenomenal qualifying laps at Monaco. At almost any circuit, when you saw Ayrton on a banzai lap, it took your breath away. Because whatever your perception was about what the best car should be able to do around a corner with the best driver, it was wrong. It always fell short. And it really looked as though he'd be given an extra 10% if he were just going slightly onto fast forward. That and just his ability to overtake, absolutely phenomenal. And again, yes, we'll never see his like again. We don't want to. We want to see other people doing different things. But I think just a combination. But I just want to hark back to that opening lap of the race in the wet at Donington Park, when he was fifth, going down to sixth through the first couple of corners, and came round in the lead of the race. He took the lead on one lap with 5 overtaking manoeuvres. And it was extraordinary. It was looking as though he was in a Formula One car and everyone else was driving in Formula 2 machinery. He was just that much better, prepared to take those risks, and mesmeric for everyone who was standing there with the early stages of trench foot on what was a hideously wet weekend.
The book is called Ayrton Senna, Portrait of a Racing Legend. It's out now. It's by Bruce Jones. It's on Carlton Books. Bruce, only begs the question, having dealt with the great Ayrton, what are you up to next? Continuing to travel the world commentating on motor racing. Sometimes I go to studios in London, but I just absolutely adore it. It's a childhood hobby that I've yet to grow out of, and it keeps me fresh, learning new names, new faces each year, not just Formula One, everything. I've got a very Catholic taste in motor racing, and I would suggest almost every motor racing fan does as well. Nothing beats being there trackside. Watching on television is fantastic, but being there. I just came back from Spa-Francorchamps last weekend, and I've always had a saying: a year without a visit to Spa-Francorchamps is a year wasted. And in the sunshine last weekend, that sort of reinforced that point. If only Ayrton was there to show it off at its best, but new heroes have to arrive, as they do in all sports.